the swarm kind of follows you around. It kind of moves. So what, Jim?
It takes 2 people.
Yeah, it takes at least 2 people to be anything at all. And I have put an empty box on top of the lid and pull the frames out and brush them off one by one. My buddy that I used to work with, he loved his blower. And you guys haven't had fun with these until you take a whole honey super and stand it up on its end and blow 1,000 bees out of it with hundreds of miles an hour of air out of the blower, and then turn that box down and then get another one. About the 3rd box you do, you've got about 3,000 to 4,000 bees in the air that aren't really happy with you at all. And we've done 60 and 90 supers like that. And by that time, it's not even funny. It's like bee soup in the air. They're really not happy with you. So some people, would, if they have 1 or 2 hives, use the what's the name of that stupid board that runs the bees?
Fume board.
No, I use the fume board. The escape board. So you pull the honey super off. You put this board with a little screen and an exit on the bottom of it. You put your honey super back on it. You do that like 24 hours ahead of when you're going to pull it. Then when you go back and pull your lid off, that particular box, if you have that on there, all the bees have moved down from it. So you can easily put your honey super off and not leave bees in it. But like I said, you have to set it off on a lid and then put a lid back over it to keep other bees out of it. Yeah. So the fume boards are the same way. Now I will tell you that if you are trying to extract a box of honey, if you're trying to get a honey super off your hive, and you've checked it and it's like 90 to 95% capped, it needs to be capped or else you're going to be pulling honey off that will potentially sour. It needs to be 18% moisture or it can sour in a period of time. So you have to pull those frames up and look at both sides of them and make sure they're well capped. I mean, you can have a small row around the outside, but you don't want any big gaps or a third of it or anything showing that's not capped. It has to be capped honey. If you have something like that, you have 2 supers on your box, move one up or move one down to find really capped ones to where you get a good rule. If you have to leave any on your hive, which you should leave some on your hive, leave them that aren't fully capped. The bees will continue to cap them or they'll eat it the way it is. It won't hurt the bees. And they will work with it until they get it down to 18%.
Yeah, I can't.
But when you pull your first box off,
So,
the first
so wait,
frame's
so
usually
look,
not
if you
that
tighten
bad
this
at
one
all.
right here,
But as it goes
right
on,
here,
you're fooling with them and you're
and
fooling with
it
them.
loosens up,
It can
can
get
you
bad.
squeeze this right
You
here?
can reduce the entrance on
Squeeze
your hive
that right
to
there,
slow down robbing.
and then
I have
tighten.
taken
Because it
in
keeps
bad
slipping down,
situations
I'm
where you have a
afraid it's
weaker
gonna fall
hive,
off.
or really beat up a weak hive. I've taken like moss and
Hold,
just
can you
shoved in the
push
entrance
these
of
two
the hive
together?
and let it go for a couple hours.
This is crazy.
And the reason I use moss
She
is
she
air
got it.
will move in and out of the moss.
Okay.
I have screen bottom boards and that's,
Yeah, it's
so
not
it's not a
bad.
huge issue.
Look
But
at
it
this.
stops the bees from being able to
This
get
thing
in and
keeps
out.
slipping down.
And then after you stop,
See? This
and
is
the bees have
it.
settled down a little in
This
an
is
hour or
tight.
2, you can go back and pull the moss out.
And then it, oh, for crying out
Just-
loud. I can't. Here, go do your thing. Go do your thing. Too much stress for me. I know.
So, I mean, they get in just like the bees, they're going right in the front entrance. But when they're real small, they might be able to get into the screens, I'm not sure. They don't get in your hives, one way or another. But if you have a strong hive that's doing well or doing anything at all, it'll keep them out or keep them at bay. If you're losing hives and you think you're losing them to wax moths, you're wrong. You have wax moths are nothing more than the buzzards of the roads. they're looking for dead critters on the side of the road. Wax moths are looking for dead hives. So if you've got a hive that's got a bunch of wax moths in it, the wax moths are just they're there to clean up Mother Nature. They didn't kill your hive. If you are not doing mite checks on your bees, and if you do not have mites, I know what the problem is. There is nobody that does not have mites. And if you're really convinced you are, come up and introduce yourself to me tonight, because I'd like to meet somebody with hives with no mites in it. So sticking your head in the sand and pretending you don't have mites isn't the answer. And I'm not saying you need to chemically treat your hives, but just saying you don't have mites because you don't want to treat them a certain way, that's fine. You need to know how bad your mites are. If your mite counts get high, there's a good chance it will devastate your hive. And the way that works is just they beat it down. It's not like a KO fight. It's like a bunch of little rabbit punches. They will take and drag your hive down to a point where it's on the weak side, and then some kind of virus is going to move in, and then there is no getting around that. That will wipe your hive out, and it happens within days. It doesn't take months and months, and you'll see it collapse. When it gets ready to collapse, it'll like fall off a cliff. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I've seen this twice, and I believe it's a virus issue. So if the weaker hive, okay, has eggs, the eggs are in the middle, there's not multiple eggs, not up on the wall, so it's not laying workers. There's larvae, there's bigger larvae, but there's no capped honey. I mean, there's no capped brood, I'm sorry, no capped brood. Is that a particular virus because of a high mite count, where they just refuse to cap them because they're sick? Or is that maybe something else? Because I've seen it in 2 or 3 hives, and we're going to do a mite check on Saturday to see what it is, but I think it's a high mite count, I think it's a virus, but I'm not really sure.
So I have seen through the years that queens will hold off laying for a period of days and weeks due to weather and other situations. So
All the other bees and all the other colonies in that yard, they've got honey coming in, they've got a little pepper coming in.
all the queens don't read the same book.
I understand that.
Yeah, so I mean, they can stop laying and you have no brood, but once she starts back laying,
What you're saying is that they stopped 18 days ago, or 17 days ago, 12 days ago, and now she starts back up. That's why
Right.
you're seeing eggs, you're not seeing cats.
I would be worried more about the mite count and something going on in that situation. If the mites are bad enough, if you had bees that were genetically altered enough to be that cleanly, they might be decapping and pulling them apart as fast as they can get to that stage.
We'll see. On Saturday, we're going to do a mite test, see how much is in there. I have a feeling it's mice.
Because people talk about ordering buckfast queens and then using Russian queens. And so, I mean, all that stuff works in different levels. But once it gets to a situation, if the mite count's really high, they're cleaning their larvae out and pitching it out the door because it has the mites on it. And so every time the larva gets to a certain stage with the mites on it, boom, they pitch it out the door. Well, if you're not some brood to hatch to become adult bees, at some point your cycle's getting shorter and shorter. You're going to start losing bees, and you're going to the hive will collapse, even though you have a hygienically clean hive. So, yes.
One last question. I found a little problem. We extracted 10 gallons of honey from 2 hives 2 weeks ago, and I have
It's not, is
So
it
there's
not
not just a lot of
holding?
rules, but
No,
so
it's
a
not
lot of
holding.
people charge charge
Okay.
different prices for
Not
their
worried
honey.
about, I mean, when.
I don't want you not gonna stand there and hold it. Do you
I
wanna,
know
do you wanna
a
prop
lot
it
of
up on the
probably
table?
low prices
You think we'll be
around
able to?
$8 a pound.
No, I'm not gonna let you stand there and,
That's pretty dirt low for local honey.
Okay,
You can buy
this-
stuff in the stores cheaper,
okay, here.
but buyer beware, you're not getting local honey. Even when you go to Publix and it says local honey,
Okay, that should hold.
that store's not
There
bottling
you go.
honey. It's from somewhere else, from somewhere else,
I know.
from somewhere else. And so beekeepers traditionally call local honey like within 50 miles of their home.
I must be doing something.
And, so you gotta keep an eye on that. So 10 to probably $12 a pound is
She's gonna prop it up.
probably a going
Yeah, I do.
price. And then, if it goes up in size, 3 pounds,
just try
5,
to
6
remember.
pounds, which is a half gallon, and a gallon, which is 12 pounds, the price comes down for us when you buy in bulk.
Don't understand.
The
That's
laws
loose.
are pretty easy now, as long as you're not trying to sell it commercially. If you're just selling it out of your house, it's real easy to sell with the Florida's
Okay, can you tighten it?
Cottage Food
That
Act.
one right there?
The state of Florida does a really kind job, I don't know, 10 years ago,
Okay.
8 years ago, 7 years ago.
If it falls,
It all works
probably won't
together.
break, right?
But we can legally sell honey as,
And it says
It's
finished.
homeowners.
Oh, no, I don't have that.
Johnny, St. Pete did not agree with that. We are not allowed to sell honey in St. Petersburg until they passed the Urban Agricultural Act in the last 6 months. All right? Don't care what the state says, is that we don't allow retail sales, personal equipment from a house, period,
From your home,
from your home.
yeah.
state of Florida.
That
says
has
you can't.
changed, only in the last
State of
8
Florida
months
says you
ago.
can do it. St. Pete just said you can't do it, you can't run a business from your home.
No.
That's where the trump card comes. Anything else? We're gonna get this wrapped up.
I had one.
Yes, ma'am.
So, so pulling, I know you already talked about this, but I was not here. We pulled honey, summer honey, and it was all capped. And we got it home and we were uncapping it and it ran. It was really, really watery. So we did, we tested it with the refractometer.
Yes.
Practice that, thank you very much, no fuss. So I know that there are a couple of things that bloom in the summertime that have a very high water content, and I'm pretty sure that it's a melaleuca, and there's another palm nectar.
Cabbage palm.
Cabbage palm. Are those the two? Because I've got like 5 buckets. Like I had to separate it, and I bought a little dehydrator, and I stir it. It's in my closet and with the door closed.
It'll come down.
It's
You can get it
drying.
down like that.
It's drying, but it's drying really, really slowly. So, so is this really typical every summer? Like, because I haven't really pulled those. I've only been here 4 years. This was the first year I was able to pull. I pulled about maybe 15 gallons, and I've got just buckets and buckets that I need to rotate them out.
So summer honey,
And
She's
down to
talking about-
18, is 18.2 okay?
if I had done 18.2, I wouldn't worry, but most of the time, summer honey, I have seen summer honey up to like 21.5%.
Yeah, I had one that was 22. I got it
Okay.
down to 19, 19. I actually bought a refractometer, just got it, borrowed somebody's, which I remember I tried to borrow yours. So 18.2, 18.5, is it gonna ferment, explode?
So
on
if you've
somebody's
got
counter?
it in the closet and you're stirring it occasionally and you're drying it out, don't stop at 18.2. Go ahead and get it to 18 or 17.9 or something.
Okay.
I mean, it's in there. You're waiting on the rest of it to dry enough. Keep going. Do you have a fan in there blowing too?
I do, I put a fan up blowing directly on it.
So what she's talking about is pulling honey that was capped in the summertime. And cabbage palm is terrible about being capped and being thin running honey. Another one that a little earlier in the summer that can be a little bit of trouble is the black mangrove. It can be a little on the liquidy side and cause you issues. So what she's done is she's pulled it, got it in some buckets in a closet where she can seal it off. She's running a dehumidifier in the closet, and she's going in and stirring the honey occasionally to move it around a little. And with a fan in there blowing on it. All that will work. It just takes weeks
Yep.
to do that.
Weeks.
Jim?
I had the same situation this summer. When you were saying
So you weren't stirring it.
I didn't stir it, but half a bucket full, each bucket was only half full. And the test after about 8 weeks, it was 15%, from 22.
So you don't have to have a refractometer. We may even get one for the association have, just so we can do some testing in case people need it.
They're pretty cheap.
They have come way down in price. The first one I think I got was like $340 or something, but they come, yeah, they come way down from that. But it's kind of tough when you have 1 or 2 hives to do that. You don't want your honey to sour. Yes, sir.
Why do the bees stop? Why do they cap it before it's ready?
I honestly think our summers are so hot and so long, and the honey is so thin, and they work it and work it and work it. Finally, they go,
Forget it. Ain't never gotten it.
you know, I mean, hey, it looks good. It looks good to you? Yeah, I'm tired of fanning. Okay. Because I mean, so in the summertime, so like we used to do orange blossom honey early in the year back when there was orange trees around. Now we have none, you can't do that. But you could put them supers on. Of course, we were in the earlier part of the year, so it wasn't 92 and 95 degrees a day. You put those honey supers on in 3 or 4 weeks, they pulled that honey down. It didn't start at 95% moisture either. It was 60, 55%, and they'd bring it right down in weeks, and you could extract it. And they'd cap it, and it'd be beautiful white. Then you get summertime, and they start putting the honey up in June, and you go, okay, I've got a nice full box of honey here. This is looking good. And into June, you still have a full box of honey, and it's looking pretty good, but it's not capped yet. And then the middle of July, you've got a pretty good looking box, but the frames aren't as deep as they used to be. They're kind of getting shallower. The nectar's pulling in on it as they get it dry. So the end of July, you're going, really? August, middle August, end of August. And these bees are fanning this stuff the whole time in 90% humidity, trying to dry it down to 18%. If you do the math, I don't know how it works. I think I'd get to a point where I go, 22's, that's close. That's, you know, within like 20, 25%. We'll let that go. We're going to eat it anyhow real quick. So, but it takes all summer for some of the bees to dry honey out. So, all right, I'm going to shift gears. I've been yelled at by my timekeeper. So if you just straggled in, or you got here, this is the Pinellas Beekeepers Association. My name is Johnny Walker. I am the president. And I got a few announcements I need to make, and then we'll get on with our speaker for the night. We are going to have a day in the bee yard on Saturday morning here at St. Petersburg Junior College at about 8:30. You don't have to be a member. Come on out, join us. You do need to sign your life away in case you get stung. That's a legal thing we have to go through. We do have some moisture issues in our bee yard, so wear decent shoes. Don't wear white, fancy sneakers. If you don't want to get muddy or don't want to get wet. So wear something that you're not afraid to trash or get dirty. Or wear higher top or hiking boots or something like that. We have veils and gloves for you to wear. This is fan participation. This is not looky-looky from a distance. So if you're the looky-looky from a distance, I'm running the class, I will hand you a frame of bees. People get really shocked when you hand them. So you can look at it, I am. No, you're not. You look terrified like you want to run, but you don't know how to run with bees. So.
And he's not kidding, he did it to me. And I got hooked.
To a bunch of people. But it is a real hands-on learning experience. And the reason I do it that way is because I learn best if I can see it being done and I can be a part of how it's being done, I can learn. So I will hand stuff off, I will show you stuff. It is so cool. I've been doing this for 16 years or so. Beekeeping, until everybody was adopted. So come on out, long sleeves. Try not to wear darker colors. bears wear black colors, bees know this. So if you come out there looking like a bear, that's what might happen. So try and wear your lighter colors, long sleeves if you got them. They don't have to be heavy, light shirt. Like I said, our bees are pretty good.
Tell them to not wear aftershave lotion or hair tonic.
So something you will notice with bees, if you've worked with them or around them some, if you change a cologne or you change a deodorant or you wear a fragrance, sometimes the bees may kind of bother you some. So try and step all that down, because bees communicate with pheromones, which are smells. And if you smell like something that a bee doesn't particularly like, you may have them coming and telling you they don't like you. So less is more in the bee world. And,
Tight pants.
like I said, yeah. Oh, so the spandex pants. They're fine for most things, but I have found when you're working on a hive and a pair of jeans get tight, 20,000 bees in the box in front of you, they will attack from the rear. Especially when you're a little sweaty and you're all bent over and they find a nice tight pair of jeans. They will let you know they found it. Then you're having to smoke the area where you've been stung. So you're not stung more. So if you can, come out Saturday morning, we'll run through this. No yelling. Timekeeper. So, that's on Saturday morning. If you can't make it on the weekend, on Saturday, we have Jim at Great Bay out there. We'll be out there at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. And he will run through the same thing. We have veils and gloves and all there. So, and he'll hand off and go through the whole hive thing. We open the hives up, go in there, look for queens, look for brood. Generally have a pretty good time.
The other thing that we're gonna do at Great Bay is we're gonna make a split from our own hive to be like our hive. So we're gonna hang around longer than the regular training. We can do some extra hands.
So if any of you are just getting into beekeeping or gonna be getting into beekeeping, a split is a very important thing, a tool to use in your hives. So you will want to learn that and see how that's done. It's very necessary. So, we are still looking for a secretary, by the way. Our secretary has stepped down, literally off the stage just now. But she stepped down from her secretary position, and we need to replace her. Little gal with a big set of shoes you have to fill. But if someone's interested in fulfilling or helping us with that position, we sure could use some help. So think about it and get back to us at the end of the thing. Also, raffle tickets. We have a bunch of things up here to be raffled off tonight. We'll do that at the end of the meeting. I did want to mention again, since we're back in the meeting, that we have a Girl Scout troop here. They're going to come out on Saturday and learn about some bees. And they have got together and collected some money and built a beehive, and they're going to donate it to us. So I would like everybody to take a moment to thank them. Thank you, ladies, very much. And I'm looking forward to seeing y'all Saturday morning. And we have a student from UF tonight that's going to be speaking. John, you want to come up and introduce yourself? And I'll just turn this thing over to you and you can make it work. Now that I have the mic on.
Okay, it's a little louder than I was expecting it to be. Yeah, so my name is John Turnus. I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida. I work in the entomology and nematology department, and I'm also working with the blueberry breeding lab there, so most of my research is going to be on blueberry. But today I'm going to talk about crop pollination a little more broadly, and how honeybees, native bees, and conservation all fit together, and how these collective efforts can be really important for crop pollination, and really all of these things kind of come together to benefit each other, benefit us as consumers, us as beekeepers, scientists, farmers, and I think there's a lot of opportunities to really work together on this stuff. So hopefully I can bring kind of a new perspective, teach you guys a little bit more about some of the bees that you spend a lot less time with each day, and also connect that back to your existing experience. And you guys are really great advocates for honeybees and for the environment in general. I've now been at several universities and seen that over and over again. Beekeepers are among our best advocates for the environment, and I think learning a little bit more about native bees can really help with that as well. It looks like we're missing a little, whatever dots I used are apparently not on this computer, so I don't know why those were weird S's. But yeah, so I did, before I get started here too much, I wanted to give a little bit of a background for myself, how I got into some of this stuff, what I'm doing now, and kind of how that led me to here. So I actually started out working on honeybees, honeybee behavior at the University of Colorado. That's where I am from, that's where I did my undergraduate work and research, and I just really fell in love with it. Like many of you, I'm sure, the very first time I got out to the apiary, I just knew. I like to say that honeybees stung me, and they've kind of set me on this path to really pursue a lot of cool questions and research on bees, but also agriculture in general. I then went on to Purdue University in Indiana, where I did my master's research, and that was really focused on insecticide use on watermelon farms and understanding how farmers can better manage pests with various strategies that can reduce insecticide use, reduce contact with bees. And then here at UF, like I said, I'm working on blueberries and how we can improve the pollination situation for farmers, and that includes things like pollinator behavior. I have a little bit of that in here, insecticide use again, and kind of just the overall scheme of blueberry farm management. I will talk about a little bit of my research here today, but I'm not going into too much depth. So if you see anything, this is just general for the entire presentation. Feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, ask me to expand on anything. I'm happy to do that as we go and have a question session to end. So a bit of an outline for what I'm going to be talking about. Really going to start off with pollinator importance and their value. Hopefully going to be preaching to the choir for a lot of you on that, but it's a really good primer. It kind of gets you thinking about how these bees can be so valuable, and in how many ways they can be valuable. Then there's the pollination problem. This is really something that's quite broad. There's pollination problems in just about every crop you can imagine. Definitely lots of them here in Florida, lots of them in blueberry and the crop that I work with. Bees as pollinators, so we're going to look at managed pollinators such as honeybees, wild native bees. I'm going to teach you a little bit about a few groups that I think are really important and look at their biology. Then we're going to talk about conservation, so how we can get these bees on the mend, doing a little better, what strategies we can do to help out their populations. There's a few big areas for that, and then I have some resources at the end. You can take pictures of that, or I can get this PowerPoint to you all, and you can look at it that way. Okay, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because many of us being beekeepers are probably somewhat familiar with it, but why are pollinators important? So really it comes down to plant reproduction. This is the way that angiosperms or flowering plants reproduce, And you can see on that left flower that you have the anther circled, and the right flower has the stigma, and essentially the anther is what's producing the pollen. Bees and other pollinators are going to collect that, interact with it, and then when they visit the second flower, they're going to transfer some of that pollen onto the stigma. That pollen transfer is what leads to seed set, fruit set. It's what ultimately gets reproduction for the plants, but it's also what is the focus for most of our fruiting crops and seed production crops. So really important that we get this process going. Some plants are actually only pollinated by animals, so there's some things like corn and soy which are able to self-pollinate or be wind-pollinated, and these are really nice crops as well, but they're a little less reliant. A lot of the things that are our real greens and really colorful plants, the things that you really like, are going to be animal pollinated. So in natural habitats, about 85% of angiosperms, so 85% of flowering plants, are going to be animal pollinated. That's not, they're not entirely reliant on it, but they are going to see some benefit from having pollinators. This helps maintain plant diversity, seed and fruit production. Once again, in a natural setting, this is really important for just keeping that ecosystem going, keeping the flowering plants actually in an area. This is really important for the entire ecosystem working its way up. So these things are often great resources for things like birds and mammals, also the insects that live there. You can imagine in a landscape like this here on the screen that a lot of the diversity that we see there in flowering plants is really important. Things are going to be visiting for nectar, pollen. Those things are then going to be food resources for larger animals. If you imagined a landscape that just had grasses, you would imagine there'd be a lot less valuable resources there for things like pollinators and a lot of other insects and birds that are relying upon those actual plants. So this idea that pollinators are really valuable in these natural settings is important because it really helps out with diversity. It increases the diversity working all the way up and has an influence on things like birds and mammals as well. Okay, so what I'm mostly focusing on is agriculture and how pollinators have an influence on this. And as I mentioned, a lot of our really colorful, most tasty things, kind of the staples of your diet, the things that you put in your salad to make your salad taste a little better, are going to be pretty heavily reliant on pollinators. So this really nice research that was now done about 15 years ago found that about 87 of the top 115 crops across the world that we're eating the most are all benefiting from animal pollinators. So that's a pretty high number when you think about it. If you thought of the last 115 foods you ate, 87 of those are going to see some benefit of pollinators. This kind of breaks down to about 35% of crop production worldwide. Of course, a lot of our grains and things that are less reliant make up a lot of our arable land that we're using for agriculture, so that's why that number is a little lower, but still, when you consider that about 1 in every 3 bites of food that you eat is at least partially due to a pollinator and was reliant on a pollinator to actually help produce that food. Okay, many of these crops are also entirely reliant upon animal pollination. So, like I mentioned, a lot of crops are benefiting from it, but some things like watermelons and passion fruit, squash, a lot of these really tasty crops are going to be entirely reliant. So, if you didn't have any pollinators, whether it's bees or other insects, you wouldn't have any watermelon, any squash. You would have to have people being paid probably to go and actually do that. And you can imagine how expensive it would be to put a pumpkin out in front of your yard for Halloween if we were having to pay people to ensure this pollination was happening. This is going to happen in a lot of crops that have what we call imperfect flowers. So this is going to be flowers that don't have both the stigma and the anther. They're going to only have one or the other. So something like squash is a great example of this. they have flowers on the same plant that are either male flowers or female flowers. And as you can imagine, it's really hard to move pollen from one flower to another if you don't have any help doing it. So again, pollinator is incredibly important for this. And then also things that are self-incompatible. So a lot of plants just don't do very well with their own pollen. They're not going to produce a lot of fruit. And so getting it transferred from a different plant is actually going to improve your pollination and your fruit set a lot as well. Okay, so here's a quick little look at some of the crops that are really reliant on pollinators. They receive a great benefit from pollinators. So a few I've already mentioned, like melons, things like kiwis, cocoa, cucumbers, apples, many of the berries, mangoes, avocados, almonds are all receiving a great benefit from pollinators. So all of these things are grown in pretty large numbers across the country. They're going to make up a good portion of a lot of the food that you're eating that is kind of your veggies and fruits. So really important crops, and they're all receiving great benefits from pollinators. These are the things that a lot of commercial beekeepers are actually sending their bees across the state, across the country to help pollinate. Some more, and some real important ones here in Florida that receive some benefit from pollinators. So things like citrus, although they're not entirely reliant, like a lot of those other crops on the last page, they do receive a pretty significant benefit from having pollinators. Things like strawberries, many beans are also actually in this group, sunflowers, tomatoes, papayas. So again, just a really good list of crops that are things that we all consider staples of our diet and really are what brighten up our plate. Okay, so in Florida, we actually did this insect pollinator evaluation, and I won't belabor this point, but that number there is really quite staggering, I think, when you consider just how important pollinators are for Florida agriculture. We calculated that they account for about $1.1 billion worth of yearly benefit to crop yields in Florida alone. As you can see, this is the highest in South Central Florida, actually areas right around here. Pinellas isn't the highest on that list because there is so much urban area here, but a lot of the neighboring counties are receiving a lot of benefit from these pollinators, a lot of economic benefit. So as you can imagine, that has a huge effect on farmers, the communities, and they're just really important. So I probably don't need to convince you all that bees and pollinators are important, but if you're really into economics, this is a pretty good signal that you should care. Okay, so the problem with pollination is that it's oftentimes hard to receive in the amounts you want. Farmers often have pretty high needs for their pollination. A lot of inputs go into growing these crops, a lot of effort, a lot of time, and so they need to be pretty productive to make it worth their while and to receive the benefits that they're really looking for growing these crops. So about 40% of our blueberry growers that we worked with about 2 years ago told us that they were unhappy with pollination. So about half of every blueberry grower is having some problems with their pollination. They're not receiving quite the amount of yield that they want, and they're attributing this to things like potentially not enough bees visiting, the bees aren't doing a good enough job when they are, poor weather. All of these things can kind of play into this pollination problem. So hopefully I'll offer some solutions that can help overcome this. That's what a lot of my research is going to be focused on and has been focused on since I've been in Florida. This really nice paper from Campbell et al. That actually came out of the honeybee lab at UF. So if any of you have been to like bee college, this is that lab that did this work. They found that the blueberry yields were limited by about 10% or more due to poor pollination. So just whacking 10% right off the top of all yields. and they calculated this to be about $6.1 million in yield losses just from poor pollination. That has nothing to do, one second, that has nothing to do with any disease or weed pressure, other pests. That's just losses associated with not good enough pollination.
Does that mean there's a tremendous opportunity for us beekeepers to ship our bees in there?
Yes. So in blueberry in particular, this is actually something that a lot of the blueberry growers I've worked with are a little frustrated by how it's worked, because as they've realized how important pollination is, so have you guys. And they used to actually charge a lot of. I've heard stories about them charging beekeepers in the past to use the land, and now they're going out begging beekeepers to put their bees there and paying for those hives. So there's a lot of opportunity there if you have a nice commercial stock of hives. The main growing season for these is going to be right kind of from January into March. So there's not a ton else going on. If you're really active, that could be around the time that you're starting to think about shipping to California for almond. But there's definitely some opportunities. There's smaller blueberry farmers who are looking for relationships with smaller beekeepers, and it represents a great opportunity for everyone. Of course, anytime you're worried about or you're working on pollination, you have to think about the insecticides that are being applied, whether or not your farmer's happy with what you're giving them. So there is a lot to think about when you're doing that. I could give an hour-long talk just on kind of working out those deals with farmers, but there's definitely opportunity to do it. So the vast majority of strawberry farmers in Florida are also experiencing similar things. So they found that insect pollination was increasing fruit quality and yields by about 30%. So you can see there in kind of the pictures on the bottom left. So you get these really nice marketable fruits in both strawberries and blueberries when pollinators are visiting, and you get stuff that nobody would eat when they're not getting any insect pollinators. Now those are both situations where pollinators are completely excluded, so oftentimes you're going to get a little bit better results than that, but if you're not focusing on pollination, you can end up with a crop that's just not marketable, stuff that nobody will really want to eat. So lots of opportunity. Yeah.
How do you control the insect that in that cage, or?
Yeah, so what we actually use is little exclusion bags. They're just mesh bags that are small enough that bees and other pollinators can't get in there. And they remain open air, so they're not having any effect on any other climactic conditions or anything. And basically you just let them go through the flowering period, and some of them will be pollinated just by chance or self-pollination, but just by excluding pollinators, you can, in some of these crops like strawberries and blueberries, you can get a really good look at how much of your crop is being accounted for by pollinators visiting. Okay, so enhancing pollination is obviously the uptake from that. So if you're not receiving good pollination, you're not getting enough fruit set, you're not getting good fruit set that's marketable, you're going to want to improve that. And as I see it from my research and talking to farmers, there's really 4 primary things that come into play that can be improved to enhance this pollination. Now we're just going crazy here. Okay. So the first is that you just have too few pollinators. And if this is your problem, this is where beekeepers can come in and be almost a silver bullet. You just don't have pollinators and you need them. Bringing in beekeepers can oftentimes do a great job for this. That's not always the solution. A lot of these farms already have a whole lot of honeybees that they have on their farm, but they're still experiencing these problems. So then you can think about things like native bees and improving your densities of those. Other things are, yeah?
Is part of your research doing how many bees they need per acre?
Yeah, so I myself am not doing any of that, but the lab I work in is doing that specifically for blueberry right now. We're pretty focused on blueberry because it is a crop that has so many of these problems. Right now, we don't have a great number for you. What I can tell you is that some of the research we've already done shows that many of our blueberry farmers are actually at a place already where they're getting good visitation from honeybees, and with the farmers that are bringing in more than about 3 to 5 hives per acre, they're not actually seeing a whole lot of improvement from that. We don't have a great explanation for as to why. It could be that a lot of those bees are kind of overflowing and going elsewhere, so you're not seeing those benefits. It's a little hard to tell, but we have future research planned to kind of get at that a little more. Yeah, so other things that could be important are inadequate pollinator foraging behavior. So I'll get into that a little bit more here in a couple slides, but different pollinators do different things, and some pollinators are really great with some specific flowers, others are better with different flowers. And so if you have a bee that's not very good at handling one flower type, and that's all that's visiting, then you're probably not going to get as good at pollination as if you had one that has a long evolutionary history with that flower. Something like the southeastern blueberry bee is native to this area. It's been pollinating native blueberry in Florida for thousands of years, and so it's very good with it. Things like honeybees aren't quite as good because they're generalists. They're not from this region, so they have less experience evolutionarily with these flowers, and so it's just kind of they're less effective on a per visit basis. Things like climate and the environment. Obviously, if you have bad weather, you can see reductions in the amount of bees flying. If you have a long stretch of bad weather during your bloom period, that can obviously have a big role. The climate stuff, here in Florida, we're a little bit, we're kind of stuck with what we have, but across different climatic regions, you see pretty big differences within the same crops. Some places just do a lot better on pollination. And then finally, things like crop traits and planting design. These are really the horticultural aspects. Things like, do you have good cross-pollination going on your farm? Are the traits of the crop actually attractive to bees? Are you putting out good pheromones? Do you have good pollen and nectar that bees are continually attracted to and they'll want to visit your crop? Okay, so this is looking a little bit more at that pollinator effectiveness. This is actually some research that was done in watermelon, and basically what they found is that blue line with honeybees, once you hit a certain threshold, and I really simplified this graph, there's numbers and it's a little harder to interpret, so I simplified it just to make it clearer for a presentation. But the blue line represents honeybees, and what they found is that at a certain amount of honeybees visiting watermelon, you stop seeing benefits from it. The watermelons aren't getting any bigger. You're not getting more watermelons. The honeybees have essentially done as much as they can do. But there are other bees that they observe, and although per visit they start out a little slower, you can see that red line is kind of starting out slower. But once they hit a certain amount of visits, they actually are doing better than the honeybees. So really the idea here is that these native bees can act as a bit of a biological insurance policy. So if you have honeybees, you're going to get some pretty good yields. But if you have these other bees, they're going to actually interact with the honeybees potentially. They're going to do their own thing. They may be flying on days when honeybees aren't. They're not in these really large colonies, so they can't afford to stay in their hive on a day when it gets cooler. And so they may be more active at a time when honeybees aren't, and that's going to be a day that you improve your pollination. Yeah?
Are there specific native bees that are better for pollinating specific crops?
Yes. So one really good example that I'll touch on a little bit here in a couple slides is that southeastern blueberry bee or bumblebees in blueberry. So what they're able to do is buzz pollination, and essentially they'll grab onto a blueberry flower and they vibrate their flight muscles. So without flying, they essentially vibrate their wings in a way that creates vibration in the flower, and it causes more pollen to be released. Honeybees and many other native bees aren't capable of this or just don't do this behavior, likely because they're generalists. So like the southeastern blueberry bee, it's visiting this specific blueberry that holds its pollen up pretty tightly, and so to get it out, it needs to do this behavior. Honeybees, if they visit something that they're having trouble getting pollen from, they can just go on to the next flower. They're not so tied to that one crop that they're actually less effective when they visit that crop. Okay, I didn't get to simplify this one much more, but here's just another example about how having native bees and honeybees in the same farm can really improve your pollination. So this is from almond production in California, and these almond producers, as I'm sure some of you know, they just bring out massive amounts of honeybees. So there's times, I don't remember the exact number, but there's times where the majority of the commercial hives in the country are in California. So it's just a massive operation. People from all over the country are shipping to California for almond production. And what they found is that they still weren't receiving quite as good a pollination as they would have liked to. So they started using this native bee, this osmia, which is native to the area. And when it's present, it actually kind of can bump into honeybees, or they can be on the flowers that honeybees want to be on. And what they found is that over enough time and a big enough farm, when these osmia are present, they move honeybees across the row, the rows that the planting is in, more frequently, and that actually leads to more cross-pollination because these farmers tend to plant the same exact cultivars down long rows. And so having honeybees bump into these osmia out in the field causes them to move across rows, which makes them better pollinators. So I just think this is a really cool example of how your honeybees are doing a great job, but they can be so good at just going down a row, and that may not be what the situation really needs to receive the best pollination. I think it's always important to remember that honeybees and all bees, they're not there to pollinate, they're there to collect pollen and nectar and do it the most effectively they can. And so for a honeybee, moving across rows actually slows them down. They're only doing this when they're interacting with these other bees that are kind of in their way. And so there's no reason for them to do it if they're not bumping into these other bees. This overall has no effect on the honeybees, of course. They're still able to collect a lot of pollen and nectar and do as good as they can do in almond production, but it does improve your pollination. Okay, this is the example I was talking about with the inadequate foraging behavior, so really looking at that buzz pollination. And some really nice research that's been done over the last 10 years or so has shown this pretty well. So essentially what they find is that bumblebees and the southeastern blueberry bee are both capable of that buzz pollination behavior I described. Honeybees don't do it, and the pollinator efficacy, so how well they're pollinating, is actually improved when they're doing this behavior as they forage. It causes more pollen to be released onto them, and then they're subsequently transferring more pollen. And so what they found is that when honeybees are visiting blueberries, that they're transferring about 7 to 11, those are different numbers because there are different studies, but somewhere in the range of about 10-ish pollen grains per visit. So every time they visit a flower, they're dropping off 10 pollen grains onto that flower. Bumblebees are doing 23 in the one study, 35 in the other. So you can see that you're getting almost triple as many pollen grains being transferred from bumblebees as they were from honeybees. And so really they're about 3 times more effective per visit than honeybees are. And this is just another example. There are also a lot of crops that honeybees are the most effective. They visit very quickly, they learn quickly, there's a lot of them per unit. But I wanted to highlight some examples where native bees were really improving honeybee pollination, and their presence out there was improving pollination, because I'm sure all of you know how great honeybees are, so I wanted to really highlight the native bees here. And just really quickly here, kind of a prediction from my research. This is stuff that we have that's actually been funded, that we're going to examine for the next couple of years. And our prediction is that having these buzz pollinators, so bumblebees, kind of that bottom left picture there, you can see when they are visiting, they're getting, they're buzz pollinating, a lot of pollen's being released. So I have those little yellow pollen grains there, they're releasing a lot. Now, if a honeybee visits that same exact flower that the bumblebee was just on, it's probably going to pick up, our prediction is that it will pick up a lot of that pollen that a bumblebee has released. The pollen isn't all collected by the bumblebee. Some of it's going to end up on the other flower parts, on the inside of the flower, and just by a honeybee visiting, they're going to pick up some of it by accident. They'll go on to another flower, and that will help pollination. Whereas if you don't have that buzz pollinator, when a honeybee visits, there's going to be less pollen that's just active and flown through the system, and they'll therefore transfer less. So a lot like that example in almond production, just having another pollinator out there, we think will actually improve how good honeybees are in the system. So hopefully what you've taken from that, and what I'll talk about a little bit more here, is that pollinator diversity improves outcomes for farmers, beekeepers, and bees. And I'm going to touch on this more, but what I mean by this is that having a lot of different pollinators, I've shown has increases pollination. It can be really good for that. It also increases the perception of your honeybees, how well your honeybees are doing for farmers, which makes them want to buy your honeybees, rent them for pollination purposes. So it has its benefits there. And then, of course, implementing some of these practices that help bees will be really important in achieving this goal. So bees are getting a lot of the focus here, but it is important to note that there's a lot of various animals that are important pollinators, so things like butterflies, flies there in the middle, that's actually a really nice fly that is mimicking the honeybee. Bats have important relationships with some flower types, hummingbirds, beagles, they can all be good pollinators in various contexts. But, of course, bees are the most important pollinators, and the reasons for this are that they're really abundant, so there's a lot of them. They exist in just about all parts of the world. You're going to get a lot of different species in those places. It's hard to go out and look at a flower and not see a bee pretty quickly. They're also diverse, so as I mentioned, diversity is important because different bees do different things, they visit different flowers, and through all of that diversity and all those different behaviors, you're going to get a lot of pollination happening. This is the really important thing that separates them from a lot of these other pollinators, is that bees are actively collecting pollen to feed to their young. So a lot of these other things, they may be visiting for nectar and maybe even pollen, but they're not actively collecting it. And that process of actively collecting pollen is what is getting so much pollen on their bodies, on their legs, on their heads. And then when they go on to the next flower, there's going to be a lot of loose pollen. If a bee sat at one flower and just drank nectar, when they went to the next flower, they hadn't interacted with all that pollen, and they're going to be less effective in transferring pollen. And that's really what we see with a lot of things like butterflies. Butterflies have these tiny little legs that are barely standing on flowers, and they're just not picking up a whole lot of pollen. They're just there for nectar. They're not picking up much pollen from one flower, and so when they go to the next one, they don't have much to transfer. And they exhibit flower constancy or fidelity. So this is something we see even with generalists like honeybees that can visit a lot of different flowers. They'll tend to go to the same flowers over and over and over and over again. For one individual visit, they'll probably visit the same flower species the entire time, and probably not change from that too much if there's enough of that resource. And that's really important from the plant's perspective because the plant doesn't want to be receiving pollen from a different species that can't actually lead to pollination of fruit set anyway. So going to the same flowers over and over again is really valuable from the plant's perspective. Okay, I did want to highlight manage bees for crop pollination here a little bit. So again, I could give an entire talk on this, and if anybody's interested in more of this, there's a lot of great resources at UF that I can point you towards. But basically, honeybees are not the managed pollinator. They're the one that is shipped all over the country, that is used for pollination all over the world, and they're really, really important. They account for billions and billions of dollars in pollination every year. In the U.S. alone, they're valued at over $15 billion. And this is dating all the way back to 2000. As you can imagine, this is really hard to assess exactly how much honeybees are worth, so that's why it's an old number. But $15 billion back in 2000. So it's probably way more now than it was even back then. So honeybees, incredibly important for our entire agricultural system, and definitely want to highlight that. But there are some pros and cons to honeybees. So the pros are that they're really abundant. They have perennial social colonies, as you all know. You all can manage them and move them around, and they do just fine, or as close to fine as we can get them. They're pretty adaptable, so they exist all over the world. They're generalists. They'll visit just about any flower that they find. But the cons are that they visit non-crop flowers. You can't stick a honeybee in, this is for all bees, but you can't stick a honeybee in a farm and say, only stay in this farm, only visit those flowers. So if you're paying for those bees, that is a con, although it's one that exists for all bees. They oftentimes have less effective pollination behavior, like I said. Being generalists, they just don't have some of these behaviors that have been fine-tuned with plants for centuries and millennia. They can be pretty expensive in some cases, so I'm sure as all of you know, if you're managing your own, it can be an expensive operation. If you're renting them for pollination, even for a couple months, it can be pretty expensive. You're renting in massive amounts of them, and so you're going to have to really invest in this solution. Hive health and the strength of the hives can be pretty variable if you are a farmer who's renting. You don't know how well your beekeeper is keeping their bees, and it's really kind of a gamble. Many of these farmers don't even know how to go about understanding how good the colonies are doing. And then, of course, there are non-native species, so this can create some problems with things like pathogens that could be spilled over. This isn't a huge con, but it's definitely something to always be aware of when you're bringing in massive amounts of anything that's not native to that area. Another managed bee for crop pollination is these bumblebees, and this is really a pretty new method. There's a couple companies that are doing this, but basically they live in annual colonies, so you're getting a new colony every single year in the wild. And so this means that the colonies you purchase are only going to last for about 8 weeks. They're also a supplemental pollination service, so you're going to put them out in your farm to improve pollination if what you're naturally getting isn't doing a good job. The pros and cons, the computer jumped to it already, but basically they are very effective pollinators for many crops, like that blueberry example I keep going back to. They're really good in a way that honeybees just don't have the behavior to do. They'll actually forage in cooler weather than honeybees, so oftentimes it can be rainy, cloudy, cool, just about the coldest day you can imagine on a Florida February day, and you'll still see these bumblebees out, and the honeybee hives will be pretty quiet. So that can be really important if you're getting a lot of those days in a row. You're really relying on getting as much pollination as you can, even in bad weather. They're also good in enclosed settings. Because they're in such smaller hives, you can put them in a high tunnel or a greenhouse and they do just fine, where honeybees are just bumping into the walls the entire time. They are native to this area, so that's a benefit. If you have any that get out accidentally, or you have any that get loose, you know they're native. The cons, though, are that there's only 2 suppliers. That creates a lot of potential problems. They can basically control the market, and if they don't have any available, you're kind of just out of luck that year. They're very expensive, so per bee, these are way more expensive than honeybees to rent. So that can be a real detriment. The colony quality can vary, just like honeybees. Sometimes you just get colonies that aren't very good. And then there's a lot of inbreeding. These two suppliers are just going out and finding as many of these bees as they can and breeding them. And so sometimes you just end up with weak bees. Okay, so one of the big solutions to these problems is to enhance wild pollinators. And there are many practices that help to preserve native bees that are also good for honeybees. So this is where I think you guys can really come in as great advocates, not only for your honeybees and for the environment, but really focusing on these native bees as well. Because honeybees receive a lot of attention, and a lot of it's been really good, but a lot of these native bees, people don't know much about. So teaching them about your honeybees and native bees is really important. So native bees are a huge group. You can't boil it down to just one bee or one type of bee. So they have a range of sociality. So everything from colonies similar to honeybees, although much smaller, typically only up to a few hundred, all the way to completely solitary bees that are living entirely on their own and only provisioning their own offspring. They're not helping out their mothers or their sisters. Most native bees are nesting below ground, so about 70% of them. Okay, and this is to really highlight how many native bees there are. And native, of course, is a relative term, but what I'm talking about here is essentially non-honeybees. So in Florida, there are over 300 native bee species, and about 29 of those species can only be found in Florida. So you go anywhere else in the world, and those species don't exist. In the US, we have about 4,000, and there's over 20,000 native bees or wild bees in the world. So really, again, great amount of diversity. All of these bees are capable of their own behaviors, and that has a huge influence on pollination. So just looking at that social versus solitary divide, so social bees are what we're all familiar with honeybees, living in large colonies, taking care of offspring together, the division of labor that they have, so some are foraging, some are nursing, and overlapping generations, so the offspring are alive at the same time that the queen is. Compared to solitary bees, which make up about 90% of all bees in North America, they don't live in colonies, and they work individually to provision their own nests. Actually pretty similar to how most animals are, where they live on their own, they're going out finding a mate, and then taking care of their own offspring. Most of us in this room probably haven't lived with our moms our entire lives and have just the purpose of taking care of her offspring like honeybees have. So really, most solitary bees are more similar to how most other animals are. So hopefully this tells you that native bees aren't homogeneous. They vary in floral preference, behavior, life history, and this all leads to differences in how effective they are as pollinators. Here's just some groups that are some families of bees that are important to know. I'm not going to touch on all of these, but that's a pretty good list of them. A few that I will touch on are things like sweat bees. They're named so because they're actually attracted to human sweat. They're very large and widespread group. They're pretty small, so about the size of a grain of rice typically, sometimes a little bigger. They can be anywhere from this metallic green to a pretty gold black color. And there's several genera that are well represented in this. You're most likely to find them on, probably actually landing on you looking for sweat, but also on a lot of white and yellow flowers they tend to like. Mason and leafcutter bees are another group. Again, these are solitary bees. These actually mostly nest above ground, so they'll create little colonies. They'll use leaves oftentimes and section off little areas where they'll provision pollen and nectar for their offspring. And they're oftentimes this dark or metallic blue color that you see in the bee in the lower, or they look almost honeybee or bumblebee-like with black and white or yellow stripes. So Apidae, which is the same family that honeybees are in, which includes bumblebees, Hopefully we all know a little bit about bumblebees, but they're large-bodied, fuzzy, oftentimes black and white or yellow. They're actually eusocial also, so living in colonies, typically of a few hundred, usually below the ground. So you can see them oftentimes a few feet below the ground. Sometimes dogs will dig them up in the winter, which doesn't always end well for the dog. And bumblebees produce a honey-like substance, but it's not anything you'd want to harvest. It's really only needing to be available for the bees for just their one annual life cycle. So storage is less of a concern. So it's not preservable in the same way that honeybee honey is. But they treat it in the same way. They'll put it in their colony. They'll store it away in cells and access it later on. Okay, so there are many practices that help to preserve native bees that are also good for honeybees, beekeepers, and farmers as well. And so the reason this is so important is looking at how hard native bees have been hit. So this review that was done in 2017, they looked at about 4,000 species of native bees, and what they found is that they only had enough data to even assess about 1,500 of them. So we just don't know a lot about 2/3 of these species. And of those 1,500, they found that half of those were in decline. So facing serious declines for their populations, you're getting less bees year over year, and then about half of those, so a quarter of the ones they assessed, they actually thought were at risk of extinction. So really dire situation for a lot of these bees. There's a lot of challenges they're facing, things like land use change and urbanization, pesticide use, lack of flower resources. All of these things have kind of combined and are really hitting them quite hard. So to conserve them, there's 3 things that I think that most of us can contribute to or talk to people about, and that is flowers, so for nectar and pollen, nest habitat, both below and above ground, and protecting them from toxins like insecticides. So for floral resources, this is important for honeybees as well. You guys really want to see kind of a diversity of flowering resources. So not only what's available at any given time, but you also don't want these huge gaps in flowering resources where you don't have anything for your bees to visit. And that's the exact same for these native bees. If they're out and about and trying to provision offspring, they need to have flowering resources available to them. So if you think about a small area like a park, there's times in a park where there's not going to be anything flowering for long periods of time. And for something like a honeybee or a bumblebee that can fly a little bit further, that may be less of a problem. They can go elsewhere. But for a lot of these bees, they have much smaller ranges, and ultimately that just leads to them not being able to live in that area. So a really nice recommendation for these is to have, if you're planting a garden, is to try and get 3 things blooming at any given time. That will support different species. Like I mentioned, some bees like some flowers more than others, and so having multiple in bloom at one time will kind of help out that overall diversity. Native plants are a really important one here. When we're thinking about native pollinators, they're going to visit things preferentially that they have a long history with, especially in the case of pollen resources. So this is also better for things that are specialists that only visit 1 or 2 flowers. If you have a specialist native pollinator and you bring in an exotic plant, it's probably not going to visit it because it has no history with it, and the things it has visited for its entire history are very different. Non-native plants, if you want them, they can still be a really valuable nectar source. I'm sure a lot of you know this as beekeepers. That is still very important, but if you can get both, that's where the native plants really come into play. And then planting in clumps so you have a high density of flowers in one area just makes it easier on the bees. They're not going to fly all over the place to access flowers. Trees and shrubs are really good early blooming plants in Florida. Things like herbaceous wildflowers are good late blooming plants here. Yellow, white, and purple or blue flowers are really good for bees. Things like red, orange, and pink flowers, they're a little less attracted to. They don't see those colors as well. We also recommend relatively short flower tubes or flat flowers, so things like the flower on the right, not the left. A bee with a shorter tongue isn't going to be able to access that nectar or pollen, and so it's basically useless to that bee. And then, of course, abundant nectar and pollen. This is just a list of some Florida wildflowers that I think are quite nice looking, but also are good for bees. You'll notice there are a couple on there that are a little more red, but some of those other colors, like on the blanket flower, are really good signals for bees to visit them. Okay, hopefully everyone got their pictures. So things like weeds and cover crops are going to be Spanish needle, thistles, spiderwort, goldenrod. A lot of these things are what a lot of people would consider weeds, but weeds is really a relative term. If it's helping bees out, I like it. Hopefully you guys do too. It's only a weed if the person who manages the land doesn't like it. So hopefully we can open up our definition or our perspective there a little bit and do things, allow plants that improve pollen and nectar flow for bees to continue to exist in places. Okay, so nesting resources are another really important thing. This is something we get asked about a lot. It's kind of a new thing that a lot of people are getting interested in. There's a few ways you can do this. So you're going to want all of these things and just about all of them, but they're kind of in varying levels of importance. So you want relatively bare ground if you're trying to attract ground nesting bees. Obviously, you don't want ground that you're going to be tilling to be where your bees are nesting. You're probably going to dig them up when you till. And so you want that area to be bare. You don't want any, bees will have easier access to it. You don't want it to be disturbed. So you're not doing anything, or it's not being driven over consistently. All of those things can disrupt nesting. Things like minimal mulch fit in with that. Bees need to be able to actually get into the ground and into the dirt to be able to nest. And then they need sun to keep the ground warm and to help the eggs and larvae that are inside of it develop. Okay, so for the bee hotels, there's some really interesting looking bee hotels out there, but really at its base, all you need is these long tubes. They can even be in like a plastic bucket like this. You want varying sizes of these tubes so that different kinds of bees can visit. Obviously, if a bee can't fit inside of a tube, you're probably not going to get it laying eggs in there. So the varying sizes can help promote diversity. You also want to have a few strategies. This is just a couple pictures of it. You want a few strategies to help your bees out once they get in there. Like anything, you need to maintain these. We recommend to replace these tubes or liners, so you can get kind of like paper straw type liners that go inside of them. You'll want to do this every 2 to 3 years, and you'll want to do it at a time where they're not capped and there's low activity. So usually after an emergence is a good time, because if you don't replace these after every few years, you'll start to get pathogen buildup and disease that can happen inside of these tubes. Just like any living animals, they can be dirty, and because these bees aren't living in a colony for a long time, like honeybees, they don't have a lot of these cleanliness behaviors that can actually ensure that these diseases aren't happening. So we need to help them out with that. Another thing we recommend is to move these every couple of years, and this can really help with predators or parasitoids, things that are going to realize that there's a lot of larvae and eggs in these colonies. Over several years, they can start to identify these places, and they'll visit and they'll parasitize or consume the bees that are developing inside of them. So moving them every couple of years also helps. Okay, and the last one I'll talk about here is protection from toxins. This is something that I've done, most of my master's research was on, also components of my PhD here at UF. It's a really kind of hot button topic. It's something that farmers are very concerned about, but they also have to manage for their pests, so it can be challenging. And essentially what this figure is showing is that there's a lot of ways that bees can interact with these toxins. So something like a spray application or dust from a planter can end up in the air, a bee's flying through the air, and it can get these insecticides on it, and could either outright kill that bee in the moment, never make it back to its hive or its offspring, or it could have negative effects on its behavior, its learning, its navigation abilities, and it could slow the bee down or get the bee lost in a way that it might as well be dead. Other ways that they can interact with some of these things are systemic insecticides, so insecticides that move through plant tissue. They're actually able to get into the plants and various tissues. That makes them really good when something's feeding on that plant to kill that. So if you have a pest that's actively consuming your crop, that's really good. But bees are visiting these same things, and you get these insecticides in the pollen and nectar, which they're bringing back to their colonies. So that can be a really bad effect. They'll also end up in things like water and soil, which bees are often interacting with as well. Okay, so how do we protect bees from these pesticides? There are a lot of best practices. These are focused a little bit more at small scale. Farmers have some different things that they should be practicing, but essentially you don't want to spray plants that are in bloom. That may seem obvious, but a lot of people do. And a lot of people will spray most at bloom because they want to protect their pretty flowers, not realizing that that's when bees are visiting, that's when bees are interacting with these insecticides. Look out for flowering weeds. So again, if you're allowing weeds to exist on your property, you don't want to be spraying them right when they're flowering either. Spray when there's low drift, so you want low wind and moderate temperatures. You don't want it to be incredibly windy because whatever you're spraying, those insecticides are probably going to end up elsewhere. Spraying late in the day is a really, really important one because bees are going to be less active, and it's going to give that insecticide time to dry overnight, and so that will really minimize your contact with bees that are visiting these plants and the insecticide you apply. And then, of course, just minimizing pesticide use. If you have something that's just there to look pretty, you can let some things chew on it, and it will probably be fine. It's probably not going to outright kill the plant, but you may have helped protect some bees that were visiting it, even if it looks a little less pretty. So definitely consider just minimizing your pesticide use, especially on ornamental plants. Using things that have low toxicity for bees, another important thing. So there are labels that show low insecticide toxicity to bees. Look for those things. When bees do come in contact with them, they won't be as harmful. Minimal residual activity, so things that are only going to be present or active for a short period of time. Avoiding things like the systemics that are able to move through plants and soil. And then looking for untreated starts or seeds. A lot of starts and seeds nowadays are getting insecticide applications that are really, in a lot of cases, unnecessary. They're happening, and then you plant your seed, and then you'll get a small plant that has residual activity, and it fades away before it can harm the pest that it's trying to target, but it could still have an effect on bees. So really not the best time to apply an insecticide. Okay, and that's all I have. Here's some resources. Feel free to take pictures. I can also send this PowerPoint or this list of various resources. The Xerxes Society is really a great overall conservation society. They have a lot of great information. They fund a lot of research. The Pollinator Partnership is another good one. Really all of these things. Florida Friendly Landscaping Guide can be really useful if you're trying to set up a garden. Protecting Bees from Rutgers is another good one. And then more information on our lab is just at that last one, the Mallinger Lab at UF. Okay, hopefully everyone got the pictures they want. And with that, I'm happy to take any more questions. Hopefully I didn't filibuster too long. I tried to hit us close to an hour, so I didn't keep you guys here all night. Thank you.
are especially good at pollinating, and what is the best way to protect them from violent woodpeckers?
Yeah, carpenter bees are a complicated one because a lot of people don't like them. I don't know of anything that they're incredibly great at pollinating. I do know actually in some crops they create some problems because they can rob nectar. So they'll create slits in flowers that then honeybees access. So that's a good example of one bee making another bee less effective. But this is, they're still very important, and I'm sure there are things that I'm just not aware of that they're really good pollinators of. So yeah, sorry that's not a more satisfying answer. Great, thank you.
All right, I'm gonna throw out a couple warnings. I've done some pollination in the last, 10 years. And I've done blueberry pollinations, me and Jimmy did a lot of them. And we did cantaloupes, and we've done watermelons and cucumbers and cantaloupes, and quite a bunch of different things. You really need to get to know your farmer if you're thinking about doing this. How he sprays and how he applies his pesticides can really affect you as a beekeeper. I mean, he pays you $40, $50 to put your hive out there for a month or 5 or 6 weeks, and he kills your hive. You haven't made any money. The other thing is the trade for land and all. You have to be careful with that because if they have blueberries planted on their property, the blueberries bloom mostly to mid-late, probably February, March. The rest of the year, you might as well put your bees in a desert. Those plants are not blooming. They're taking up the place of other plants. They mow the place, they keep it looking nice, and there's not going to be a bunch of other weeds and stuff growing around there. So there will be nothing for your bees to do 11 months out of the year. So be careful what you get into or what you ask for. Beekeepers do get paid for bringing their hives out. Don't sell yourself short selling your honey or sell yourself short pollinating. If you're going to do a small pollination on a small farm we had some of Pasco that were less than 10 acres, and we put bees on them. So you don't have to have thousands of hives to be a pollinator. But don't sell yourself short. Make sure you get the biggest thing I saw and the biggest rub I saw with the farmers was beekeepers, especially commercial, were bringing their bees in, and I would go by some of those hives and cringe because you would not see bees coming from the hives. And I actually went on one farm, and when I got off in a back corner by myself, and I actually flipped a few lids. And what commercial guys will do, not all of them, but a few of them, just to keep their numbers up, will throw 2 or 3 frames in a 10-frame box. And so if you're going to do it, make sure you have decent bees and have a reputation of what you're doing. That's just robbery. It's selling the whole thing short. So,
Johnny, I read about in California, they do a rating per hive. So they have a way of rating the hive and say, okay, this is 100% hive, this is a 70% hive, and paying accordingly.
that's in California. They do inspect them. A lot of your farmers on your smaller, they don't handle bees. They don't want to handle bees, and they don't want to be involved with the bees. Other than they need them on their property to do the pollination. I've been told. So you had stats up there with different numbers. I've been told some of your vegetables and some of your fruits and nuts are even higher. But so you're looking at 35 to 75% better take on the crops. Well, if you have an acre of whatever, and you can increase the fruit, the nuts, the vegetables, whatever, by 75%, that's a big turnaround. And we're not talking about more fertilizer, more water, more anything. It's the same amount of plants, the same amount of fertilizer, the same amount of water. But just by the better pollination, or different kinds of pollination, it can increase that yield on their plants. So it's worthwhile to the farmer, but he needs to be getting a good product. So if you're gonna do it, but don't plan on putting your bees out there and having a good pollination and being able to make nectar off of property all year long, because it's not there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I did just want to say, that's definitely an important disclaimer for everyone. I think if you're doing something like this, it's a lot like getting into really commercial honey selling. Like, there are so many things you have to consider. You have to work very closely with these farmers. They have to know exactly what to expect from you. You need to know what their practices are. It's not something to be taken lightly. So you did a great job explaining that. But yeah, I just wanted to, there are opportunities out there, but you have to know what you're doing, and it, for a lot of people, can become their main source of income, and they're not even thinking about honey on those hives at all.
So I was doing blueberries early. We'd take our blueberries, we'd take bees to blueberries at the end of January. We'd run them there for a few months, and then we'd snatch them up and move them over to cantaloupes. So I was getting 2 pollinations in the spring and bringing them back, still getting summer and fall honey off of them. Did have some losses due to pesticide drift and all. I had some really good farmers. They minimized when we worked where we put the bees and how we put the bees. So
you got less than 10 minutes to get us out of here.
less than 2 minutes to get you out. So don't forget about Saturday or Monday at 10 o'clock. I had a great day. Saturday here at 8:30. I thank you for coming out, and I'm being rushed. So